Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Shubh, and welcome back to another episode. This is Marvel number 11, and, we're just about 3 more episodes away from being done with this, and it's kind of daunting to me because, going back to the format that I used to conduct my episodes in before this whole MCU breakdown. And of course, I will do a bit of a reflection at the end of all of this, sort of debrief of this entire journey that we've been on so far. But it's daunting, as I said, to imagine that I have to go back to reviewing movies, mostly because there's not many new movies coming out. I know there's been quite a few sort of high-profile releases. Namely, I'm thinking of Ending Things. Charlie Kaufman's newest on Netflix comes to mind, but I've just gone so invested into the MCU, and it's a tribute to these movies that I can't really imagine myself escaping this world right now because I've been drawn so deeply into it. So, without further ado, let's talk about the movie of this episode, and that is Ant-Man and the Wasp. Now, I'll say this. Ant-Man is the 20th movie, but it's also the 50th Marvel movie since the boom of Marvel movies in 1998. That was started by Blade. It's perhaps one of the least memorable, but it's not bad. I don't want to say it's bad, but it's one of the least memorable films for me of all these movies, except for where I went to watch it. So I've only ever really seen movies in the cities I've lived in. So I've seen movies in Delhi, I've seen movies in Singapore, I've seen movies in New York. I've obviously seen movies in LA because I go there to visit family a lot, and I've seen movies in Bombay because I lived there for 3 months. Apart from that, I can't say I've really been to a movie anywhere else except for one city, and that's Middlebury, Vermont. So it's 2018 when this movie just came out. It was the summer, me and my family, we were on a college tours. My sister was applying to colleges that year, and she was interested in Middlebury, and we drove all the way up there, and we were there for like half a day, and we had nothing to do, so my family and I just went to go watch a movie, and incidentally there was one next to where we were staying, theater. It was a very small theater, very old-timey, it wasn't like a reserved seating situation. You go in and you take whatever's open, first come, first serve. And it was such a foreign experience to me, going to a movie in like a small-town movie theater. But it was fascinating, and it was such a great experience because it felt like, everyone was laughing at the jokes together, and everyone was really invested all at the same time. That atmosphere is something I definitely miss and haven't seen something like it since. But anyway, Ant-Man and the Wasp, it was the third movie since 2018 for the MCU. In 2018, sorry, third movie in 2018. The first two, Black Panther and Infinity War, they were record-breaking phenomenons. like Ant-Man and the Wasp, it was modestly successful. I mean, it was the lowest grossing film of the entire Phase 3, sort of running from 2016 to 19. It also didn't have much narrative weight for like the larger story at play, especially after Infinity War had just come out. It felt pretty insignificant. It was sort of like the breezy caper film, like the B movie that comes in between Infinity War and Endgame. It's like the little palate cleanser between devastating loss and redemption. It ends with Thanos, obviously. Infinity War ends with Thanos obviously snapping away half of life and universe. And, given that most MCU fans would wonder why they should care about this movie at this point. So then Marvel's places a sort of rebuttal to that. They ask why a breezy, fun, small, low-stakes movie was the wrong thing and why it isn't the right thing. Ant-Man, as I said in my Ant-Man episode, it was a wonderful palate cleanser for the MCU. It was a heist film in the superhero genre. It was different from, the galaxy ending or city-destroying threats that you see in so many of these movies. Ant-Man was quieter, it was less splashy, it was more fun. And it was a balance to the massive spectacles. And the Marvel Studios, they have this huge success, obviously, with a license to adapt very strange and niche comic book properties like Doctor Strange and Guardians of the Galaxy. There's something about the studio behind the Avengers, there's something about Marvel Studios that's quaint. And that's Ant-Man. Beyond that, most elements of Ant-Man and the Wasp would be incorporated deeply into the overarching MCU storyline with Endgame that makes this movie sort of significant, but retroactively, in that everything that's discussed in this movie would become relevant in Endgame, obviously, but obviously the fans don't know about this yet. At least that was the case in the time when it came out. The other sort of significant aspect of this movie is that there's a prominent inclusion of the Wasp. At this point, Black Widow is the only female superhero, and there's obviously other female Avengers and female Guardians of the Galaxy members and strong female characters, but no real female superhero had been featured in the title of an MCU film until Ant-Man and the Wasp. 8 months later, obviously, we had Captain Marvel come out, and that was a far more female-centric MCU movie. But bringing the Wasp to the screen and adding her to the title, it's a nice and overdue step from the MCU. Janet Van Dyne, or the Wasp, was a significant character in the Marvel Comics. She was created by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Ernie Hart for Tales to Astonish number 44. In the beginning, she's a young and sort of flighty daughter of Dr. Hank Pym. In that issue, she becomes Pym's lab assistant and also partner. Sorry, I misspoke. Janet was the daughter of a colleague of Hank's, not his daughter, because the next part I'm going to say would make that sound very weird. Eventually, they become love interests. Obviously, like Pym, she has the ability to shrink using the Pym particles, but unlike him, her suit has wings and stingers, and they're operational when she's small. Ant-Man and the Wasp, their stories sort of continued in Tales to Astonish, but mostly Janet was the only female founding member of the Avengers that formed in Avengers number 1 in 1963. Her important stories, they came in the Avengers rather than her own books. In the 60s and 70s, naturally, Janet was depicted very one-dimensionally. She was shown as a ditzy and very over-feminine caricature, very unfocused and weak in battles. But later writers, they were more effective at incorporating this stereotypical femininity into a more fleshed-out character with authenticity. In the 70s and 80s, Hank Pym becomes more troubled, and he deals with anger and insecurities, and famously hits Janet, who is at this point his wife, in a domestic dispute. And for that, he's kicked out of the Avengers. At this point, Hank Pym fades from the comics, and Janet becomes sort of more in the limelight. She becomes the official leader of the Avengers for most of the 80s, and second to only Captain America as the longest serving leader of the Avengers.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
And, despite the fact that she was a founding member of the Avengers and one of its longest-serving leaders, and, the stalwart in the Marvel Comics, it took 20 movies to get her to fully be depicted on screen. There's complications around this character, because the Ant-Man writers chose to focus on Scott Lang, who inherits Ant-Man from Hank Pym. So there were allusions made to Janet in the first movie. There's an implication that Hank and Janet's daughter Hope would become Wasp in the sequel, and the sequel wasn't a sure thing at this point. In 2014, 9 months before Ant-Man was released, Marvel Studios announced 9 movies as part of their Phase 3, and it didn't include another Ant-Man movie. The success of the first film was not a given at that point. Ant-Man was well received, and Marvel Studios then eventually obviously rearranged the schedule to incorporate Ant-Man The Wasp. So Marvel boosted the popularity of Ant-Man by including the character in Civil War alongside nearly every other MCU hero. And that movie made like twice as much as Ant-Man and included a couple of standout moments for his character, and Paul Rudd really sort of grasped them. And Marvel put, their full support behind him. The main cast of Ant-Man signed to return for the sequel, and so did the director Peyton Reed. Peyton Reed was a last-minute replacement for Edgar Wright, who developed Ant-Man for like a decade. He left the project over creative differences with Marvel, and Peyton Reed, he deserves a lot of credit for crafting such a beautiful film despite all of the behind-the-scenes stuff. For the sequel, he had the opportunity to make his own rather than something that someone else had developed. After several hints in the first film, Reed needed to have Janet in this film. And he organized the entire movie, its plot and its story around rescuing her from the quantum realm. And thus, the title is both for the older and the younger generations, Hank and Janet, and Scott and Hope of Ant-Man and the Wasp. The sequel, it talks again about the themes of restoring bonds of family, as well as the same sort of smaller scale and lighter tone. It also follows the same sort of crime caper plotting aspect. Whereas Ant-Man #1 was a heist movie, the sequels seem to be inspired by Elmore Leonard novels. These typically feature sort of large, colorful criminal casts with cross purposes that create endless obstacles and complications for all the ensemble. There's no real villain in this movie. There's just a bunch of obstacles. To be honest, it could be compared very closely to the Disney adventure movies of the 50s and 60s. It feels like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, or even The Absent-Minded Professor. There's not a slight in the least. Ant-Man and the Wasp, it's a family-friendly science fiction adventure film that, it's very much like the live-action Disney movies of that era. Beyond the lack of villains, the film also has a bunch of straightforward and imaginative technology that... it's exciting for a lot of funny gags for a lot of ages. When Disney first got Marvel Entertainment at the end of 2009, a lot of Marvel fans thought that Marvel movies would become Disneyfied, and that's like taking away sharp edges and mature themes, and to conform for that family-friendly image of the House of Mouse. Ant-Man and the Wasp, it's that kind of movie that fans kind of feared, but it's the only MCU film produced on those terms. Even then, that's what makes this movie sort of fun and different. It's the movie that Marvel fans can show to their kids as a sort of introduction to the MCU. It's fun, it's funny, it's exciting, it's unchallenging, and it's colorful, all in the best of ways. That's the best part. The bad news is that it's not very consequential. The supporting characters don't offer anything to the story except for gags or, little instances of catalyst behavior. Also, by sort of continuing the themes of the first movie, there's a very limited development for the main characters. The first film is about fathers and daughters, and the second is sort of just seeing how they maintain those relationships when estranged fathers and daughters come back together. The two leads also sort of develop from an argumentative to romantic relationship in the first film, and the second movie begins with them broken up and allows them to fall in love again. Very repetitive. Treading on the same sort of ground, it's natural for a lot of poorly imagined sequels. There's a lack of strong character development, and the purpose is... It's most crushing when it comes to the Wasp, because she's who the marketing focused on, and, the idea and the story of creating a finally female key superhero in a Marvel movie. But since rescuing Janet is the ultimate goal of the superhero movie, but she only appears in the end, and, Hope should be equal to Scott in screen time, but is disappointingly underserved. She has a good relationship with her father, and she rekindles her romance with Scott and wants to find her mother. That's pretty much all that we see of Hope. Nothing else.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
So the movie opens in the late 80s with Janet Van Dyne, played by Michelle Pfeiffer, and Hank Pym, played by Michael Douglas, saying goodbye to Hope before leaving on a business trip. There's a voiceover where Hank explains that they were on a mission to stop this missile from striking a city, and they get to the missile as their shrunken forms, but are only able to stop it if one of them goes down by shrinking into the size smaller than an atom, which goes and shrinks them uncontrollably into the quantum realm. Hank made the conclusion that no one could ever return from the quantum realm, but in the climax of Ant-Man, that's exactly what Scott Lang did. So with his daughter Hope, Hank starts to build a quantum tunnel capable of finding Janet and rescuing her from the quantum realm. And that's sort of the drive of this film. Everything that happens is service to its complications or obstacles to the success of this plan. 3 years later, Scott is estranged from Hank and Hope after Captain America Civil War's events. In that movie, the UN ratifies an agreement. Superheroes need to be operating under governmental insight, and that causes personal drama between the Avengers, and there's a climactic role in Germany. Captain America recruits Scott to his side, and the fight has Scott, growing into Giant Man. And at the end, he's arrested and charged with unlicensed superheroing. So, when Ant-Man The Wasp opens, Scott has been serving a prison sentence for about 2 years, supervised by FBI agent Jimmy Woo, played by Randall Park. While inside his house, in house arrest, Scott, he does what a lot of us have been doing for the last sort of 8 months. He spends his time drumming, bowling, bouncing rubber balls, singing karaoke, reading, learning close-up magic. He also remotely works at his security startup with Luis, who's Michael Pena reprising his role, and builds cardboard forts and slides for his daughter Cassie. Scott's main motivation is to be a responsible parent for Cassie, and that was the motivation from his first movie as well. Unfortunately, Scott's work in Germany exposed the work of Hank and Hope that made them fugitives as well under the Sokovia Accords, so they obviously no longer speak to him. But Scott only has 3 days left on his house arrest, and he has a great relationship with Cassie, his ex-wife Maggie, played by Judy Greer, and her husband Jim, played by Bobby Cannavale. He has an exciting new business, and he just wants to get his life back on track. Then Scott has a dream about the quantum realm and experiences one of Janet's memories. It's strange enough for him to change everything and call Hank. As soon as he does that, he's knocked out and taken by Hope in a miniaturized SUV to a weird grey building in which there's a lab where Hank and Hope hide their quantum tunnel. It's a very impressively retro sci-fi set, but it's the largest set built for any MCU film up to this point, which is ironic because this is Ant-Man. Hank, he explains that they tested the quantum tunnel at the exact moment that Scott had the vision, that they opened a gateway to the quantum realm, and Janet sort of reached out to them through Scott. They think that Scott and Janet obviously have become entangled in the quantum realm, so they have to have his help to rescue her, but Scott really doesn't care. He only cares about his house arrest coming to an end in 3 days and the dangers of, breaking it before it ends. And that's how his situation becomes an obstacle to saving Janet. He wants to help, but he doesn't want to get caught and jeopardize his freedom and time with his daughter. Fortunately, Hope and Hank programmed an enlarged ant to live in Scott's house, mimicking his daily routine. And he wears his ankle bracelet. This leads to gags like the ant lounging on a couch, eating Fruit Loops, or, drumming. The house arrest obstacle, it still comes up occasionally. It's sort of the first villain in this film. Unfortunately, Hank and Hope have been on the run since Scott was arrested. But fortunately, they travel in various shrunk-down toy-sized cars that are stored in a case. Even better, their lab also shrinks down to the size of a suitcase, and it has wheels and an extendable handle. They've nearly finished the quantum tunnel, but they need one more thing, and getting that thing shows, sort of reveals the next obstacle in saving Janet, which is Sonny Birch, played by Walton Goggins. So Birch, he specializes in trading black market technology, but he's figured out what Hope and Hank are building. When Hope wants to buy the final component, Birch offers to buy the lab for $1 billion on behalf of a secret backer. Hope refuses, and Birch spends the rest of the film trying to steal the lab, and that's the obstacle. And that's really all he is in the film. He's an obstacle. Birch he's not menacing, or he's not sort of defined enough to be like the villain of the film. He's just sort of an annoyance, in very true Elmore Leonard fashion. The missing quantum tunnel component, it's never explained. Birch's backer is never identified. It's not important. The film manages to get the most out of a very shallow obstacle by casting Goggins, who's just a very fantastic character actor, and really good at balancing menace with a bit of buffoonery. Birch has a fun scene later where he interrogates Luis with truth serum. It's a callback to the first film, the Luis tip montage. In these montages, as I said in the first episode, Luis, he explains something in his very particular brand of over-detailed storytelling. As he does, the film cuts to the people that he's talking about, and they lip-sync along to his narration. In this case, when Birch asks where's Scott, Luis interprets where's Scott as in where's he emotionally. So his monologue follows Scott from meeting Luis in prison, to meeting and falling in love with Hope and Ant-Man, to Hope dumping Scott, to Scott reuniting with Hope. It's a very predictably hilarious montage, but it's just, it's there to please the fans of the first film. They could have cut it to make the film, leaner, to be honest, and it wouldn't have changed a thing. Or they could have rewritten it to actually make it matter. But, the Birch subplot also provides the first opportunity to demonstrate the skills of the Wasp. He initially refuses to sell the component to Hope. As I said, he wants to buy the lab. So she leaves to return as the Wasp. In the first movie, Scott struggled with the Ant-Man suit, getting used to it. But Hope comes in here as an expert. She shrinks and grows seamlessly. You can tell that she's been doing it for a bit. Birch's men, she sort of fights them through a restaurant and a kitchen to get the last piece, and prevents some from escaping by enlarging this salt shaker in front of a door. And she shrinks between knife throws to avoid them as they're being thrown. Also, unlike Ant-Man, the Wasp suit has wings and wrist blasters, so the fight is sort of more kinetic. It's inventive, it makes use of the unique powers of the hero. For Evangeline Lilly, it felt that it was important that Hope was able to express herself femininely, during these conflicts, not sort of regressing to the female stereotypes or defaulting to masculine traits, like the Ant-Man comics in the 60s. Female superheroes are obviously rare on film, and Evangeline Lilly wanted the Wasp to feel distinct from the male ones, but also effective. So the sequence, it's fun, but it also introduces the third major obstacle to saving Janet. In this, Hope is confronted by a ghostly attacker in a white suit. I say ghostly because it's literally a ghost. The attacker, she becomes intangible, jitters out of sight, and leaves fading images behind like a ghost. And this is Ghost, played by Hannah John Kamen. She steals the component and the shrunken down quantum lab before disappearing. So without any equipment to sort of track the lab, Hank reaches out to his former partner, Bill Foster, played by Lawrence Fishburne.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Now, Foster, he needles Hank about losing Janet. He demonstrates that they have a fractured and sort of contentious relationship, but he agrees to help. He suggests that tracking the lab using Hank's old Ant-Man suit, which Scott has hidden. Unfortunately, he hid it in a small trophy that Cassie brought to school for show and tell. And it's like a silly tangent for a film, It allows for a fun sequence, though, so you enjoy it. There's a new Ant-Man suit that has a sort of malfunctioning regulator that causes Scott to suddenly grow or shrink at random. So when he sneaks into the school with Hope, Scott becomes a giant in the janitor's closet and then shrinks to the size of a kindergarten student. At this point, the score of Christoph Beck, it mirrors this shrinking predicament by switching to tiny old video game instrumentation on the score. The suit is recovered eventually, and the heroes find Ava. They're immediately captured by Ava and Foster, but the film then tells her story. Ava's father was a colleague of Hank's, but Hank had him fired and discredited. He moved to Argentina to continue the quantum experiments until one exploded and killed Ava's parents and caused Ava to begin uncontrollably phasing. The atoms in her body, they break down and reform, and her physical form occasionally becomes intangible. So Foster met Ava while working for S.H.I.E.L.D. in Argentina and offered to help her. She was trained as an operative and given a suit to help her control the powers that she had, but obviously she was never cured. She believes that drawing energy from the tunnel or even from Janet directly would heal her. It's a lot of exposition, but the film sort of breaks it up with Cassie and Scott FaceTiming about her soccer shoes. Foster is helping Ava, but he's uneasy with the idea of hurting anyone to save Ava's life. They're not truly villains, they're just trying to save her life. But since they want the quantum lab for their own reasons, they're an obstacle to saving Janet. Ava and Foster also sort of fit into the larger theme of this film, which is restoring families. Obviously, Scott wants to be with his daughter without the house arrest. Scott also wants to rekindle his romance with Hope, his friendship with Hank, but that jeopardizes his freedom. Hope and Hank want to reunite with Janet, and now obviously Ava and her father figure, surrogate father, I should say, Foster, want to cure her before she dies. There's very little drama in Scott being able to see his daughter more than he already does, or the sort of inevitability of Hank and Hope finding Janet. So this sort of works. But we don't get invested enough in Ava or Foster. So because of that, this movie sort of feels shallow, even though it has very imaginative and inventive set pieces and visuals and very entertaining characters. These arcs, they're just not defined. Scott, he helps his friends and avoids the FBI, but he doesn't grow. Hope wants to reunite with her mother, but nothing really changes because of it, or even while she's attempting to. And even the long-awaited reunion with her mother doesn't give Hope like a very emotional, showy scene. It's kind of downplayed. And Paul Rudd is still the center of the film. Once they recover the lab, Hank and Hope, they test the tunnel again, and this time Janet completely, fully possesses Scott, and it allows her to calibrate the tunnel to find her precise location. Paul Rudd does this scene as Janet very well and very funny without going over the top. Janet compliments Hope like a proud mother and banters with Hank like a long-time wife. It's a fun scene, but it's a major loss for Hope's character to have her major motivation happen through the male star of the film. The second act of the movie, with all of the obstacles converging, is sort of where it ends. Janet adds her coordinates with only 2 hours to reach her, ticking clock deadline. Meanwhile, Birch alerts the FBI to their location. That means Scott has to rush home before he's found that he's been violating his arrest. He leaves Hank and Hope to be arrested, and Ava steals the lab from the FBI. Scott obviously gets a nice pep talk from Cassie, and he rescues Hank and Hope from custody. And this convergence of everything, Birch and Ava after the lab, the FBI after the heroes, the ticking clock, it's a very fun third act. There's a lot going on, and the loose ends are tied together very nicely. Scott, so he begins by luring Ava out of the lab, which allows Hank to enter the quantum tunnel in this sort of spaceship-like thing that, obviously it recalls another 60s sci-fi film, Fantastic Voyage. Hank, he shrinks down past trippy and very visually impressive realms on his way to the quantum realm. And once he's there, he almost nearly loses his mind to the chaos until Janet emerges. As Avengers Endgame makes clear, time works very differently in the quantum realm, which means that Janet obviously should not have aged 30 years, but she did. The filmmakers wanted her to be significantly older to ensure that there's a strong sort of emotional impact to finding her. But despite that, they worked very closely with the filmmakers behind Endgame to make sure that the elements of the quantum realm line up between the two films. At the time, audiences didn't know it, but Ant-Man and the Wasp establishes a very important plot device that forms the basis of the biggest film of all time. Janet enters a ship, and they have to wait until the lab is enlarged in order to return. The lab has been shrunk to help hide it, obviously. So Hope, as well as Luis, they lead Birch's men on a car chase through San Francisco. It's a pretty interesting city to have a car chase in. Luis drives, and Hope and Scott shrink and grow. They move into an all-around. They move into and sort of all around his vehicle to take him out. Hope, she flies onto one car. She enlarges and fights some henchmen. She shrinks to fly out as they crash. She throws shrinking pellets on motorcycles and, even enlarges this Hello Kitty thing to throw at others. Ava is also in the mix here because she's sort of throwing the suitcase-sized lab from person to person like a hot potato. Ultimately, Birch, he gets on a ferry to the bay with the lab. Scott flies to him on ants, but the seagulls make that very difficult, so he grows enormous to about 60 feet to chase Birch. He's first mistaken for a whale by the ferry, but then emerges to grab the lab. Scott returns to the lab to the shore before passing out from the strain of growing, and Ava enlarges the lab on the shore where Hope rescues Scott. Hope and Scott fight Ava in the lab until Hank and Janet's ship sort of bursts out of the quantum realm. Hope and Janet have a kind of tearful reunion, not very. And Janet heals Ava with her quantum energy. It's implied that Janet was changed by the quantum realm, and that it's going to be explored in a future movie. It's all that's left then is a sort of series of happy endings. Ava's healed, so she goes away with Foster. Luis catches Birch and his men for the FBI, giving his company great exposure. Scott misdirects the FBI by leaning a giant Ant-Man suit against a building that allows him to get home. His house arrest is lifted, so he hangs out with Cassie and Hope. Finally, Janet and Hank shrink their house to move to a secluded beach. The film ends before the effects of Infinity War reach their characters in the mid-credits scene. But the filmmakers wanted the main film to have a happy ending. That's because Ant-Man and the Wasp is it's a good-natured family film. There's no villains, there's no real reckoning force, it's just obstacles. There's no threat to the galaxy, most of the people's lives are also not at threat most of the time. It's just the unity of the family. None of these movies are particularly sexualized or gory or adult. That's, more Deadpool. But a lot of Marvel movies feel somewhat mature. This makes Ant-Man and the Wasp sort of the perfect movie for kids. Unfortunately, the movie doesn't go much deeper than these exciting and inventive funny sequences, but it works as pure entertainment. The character motivations obviously are repeated from the first film, like I've said. Ant-Man and the Wasp is notable for having the first sort of female superhero in the title, but it doesn't give the female superhero enough material or development, and eventually sort of sends a message that the male superhero still has to do her work for her. The film, it doesn't have anything to say or the ways for characters to grow. If it did, it would be much more satisfying. Obviously, though, it was successful. It earned about $217 million in North America and $623 million worldwide, which is a 20% increase over the first movie. I suppose most of these are because of the increased exposure of Ant-Man in Captain America Civil War and sort of the overall increased success of the MCU at this point. But even then, Ant-Man and the Wasp, it's the lowest grossing film in Phase 3 of the MCU, much like Ant-Man was the lowest grossing of Phase 2. Ant-Man, he's also one of the superheroes noticeably missing from Infinity War, but it's nice to have smaller characters, and smaller series within this huge MCU. Marvel Studios has been successful enough to take risks with niche characters like Ant-Man, and Ant-Man and the Quantum Realm becomes central to Endgame. Months after that film was released, Peyton Reed, he signed to direct a third Ant-Man film, so despite this character's relatively modest success, the little guy of the MCU will endure. Alright, that's all from me for today. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. You can also follow us on Twitter at GSMC_movies. Thank you for listening. This has been Shubh and stay tuned because the next 2 episodes, bigger ones. It's Infinity War and Endgame. Alright, take care.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.